We tend to think of plants as kind of passive parts of scenery, but when humans make the wrong decisions about them, the consequences can be severe. That's why today we're looking at 8 times humanity underestimated the botanical world and paid the price, from the pretty shrub that destroyed Scotland's rainforests to the silk obsession that led to bloody riots in the streets of France. These stories show that when it comes to plants, good intentions and terrible outcomes are more than happy to grow together. By the way, shout out to 2 amazing books that inspired this episode: Around the World in 80 Plants by Jonathan Drury and Lucille Clerc, and Death in the Garden, Poisonous Plants and Their Use Throughout History by Michael Brown. In the 18th century, wealthy British landowners wanted to add a little extra oomph to their Scottish estates. Scotland's lush green native plants were pretty, sure, but they'd seen it all before. And when you've got money to burn and a competitive urge to be the most oppressive estate in the land, you're going to look for something new, which is how the Rhododendron ponticum began to be imported from the Iberian Peninsula. We think sometime around 1763, though by whom is still up for debate. Some say it was Conrad Lodigius, the founder of Lodigius Nurseries. It had everything. It was hardy, evergreen, and bloomed the most spectacular purple flowers. They planted it everywhere, like lining driveways, decorating gardens, and using it as cover for game birds. It seemed like the perfect landscaping hack. It was pretty expensive for a plant back then, around 25 pounds today, so the rich gardening nerds of the time would only buy a few. Though, as any plant collector knows, after that first hit, it's hard to stop. The problem, though, was that this expensive plant was not cold hardy. Bitterly cold winters were recorded in 1859 and 1894, which would have decimated rhododendrons that were planted outside and left unprotected. And if you've ever lost a plant that's hard to get in your area, you know how frustrating that can be. And that's when the real trouble began, because the gardeners and the botanists began to tinker. Through selective breeding and hybridization with other rhododendron species, they engineered a kind of super rhododendron that was tougher, colder, hardier, which is kind of essential in Scotland, and incredibly easy to propagate, which became a big, big problem. What they didn't realize was that in its native home, Rhododendron ponticum had natural checks and balances, but in the wet, acidic soils of Scotland, it had none. And this new, tougher version became a biological machine, producing millions of tiny wind-blown seeds, quietly laying the foundation for its eventual takeover. Its seedlings are not drought-resistant, so they need consistent moisture in order to germinate, making Scotland the perfect incubator. Now that it was easy to propagate and grow, its rarity went away and suddenly became available in nurseries across the country. The price of one plant went from £25 in today's money to £2.76. Then nurseries began to offer them in packs of a dozen, then in packs of 100, then in packs of 1,000 for about 7 pence per plant. Again, in today's money. Who was buying 1,000 rhododendrons? I can't say, but it being listed in the clearance section of this 1912 ad doesn't bode well for the rhododendron market. Now, everyone who had a little bit of money and a piece of land could own this exotic purple beauty. By 1838, rhododendrons were everywhere throughout Britain. Scottish botanist John Claudius Loudon said, quote, "It has since spread through the country with such an extraordinary degree of rapidity that there is now scarcely a shrubbery or pleasure ground in Britain without it." There was some pushback about it in the 1870s, warning that planting rhododendrons was ill-judged. But it wasn't until the 1930s that alarm bells began ringing, and by then it was too late. As it escaped cultivation, the plant formed dense, light-choking canopies that wiped out native bluebells, mosses, and tree saplings. It even acted as a reservoir for deadly plant diseases like sudden oak death. Today, the rhododendron is considered invasive in Scotland, where officials estimate it will cost £400 million over 10 years to combat it, making it one of Scotland's most expensive botanical blunders. Yet, the rhododendron still has some fervent fans. In 2002, a so-called action group threw rocks at machines brought onto a Huddersfield farm to eradicate plants overtaking the property. By the 1840s, most of Ireland's land was owned by wealthy, absentee British landlords. Their tenant farmers were often only allotted unproductive plots of land that were so small, growing crops to feed livestock, never mind your family, was nearly impossible. However, there was one crop that could grow, specifically a type of potato called the Irish lumper. Now, this wasn't your fingerling or a good russet. By most accounts, it wasn't even good, being described as wet, nasty, and knobby. But what it lacked in culinary affection, it made up for in calories and hardiness. Lumpers could grow in the poor soil of Western Ireland so proficiently, records say you could get 6 tons of lumpers on 1 acre of land. For the Irish families trying to live off a fraction of that, it was a saving grace that kept them alive. Lumpers became so prolific that Ireland's farmers established a reliance on it, effectively creating a monoculture. And it's a good thing there are no idioms or proverbs about what happens when you rely on one thing to sustain your life, because that's always a good idea, right? Since every lumper potato contained the same genetic makeup, that meant each one had the same weakness. In 1845, a mold called Phytophthora infestans arrived from North America, likely hitching a ride on a ship. Now, in a diversified ecosystem, a pathogen could eliminate maybe like 10% of your crop. Well, that might suck. You've still got plans B, C, D, whatever. But in a world full of genetic clones, it was a massacre. The fungus spread like wildfire. A single infected plant could infect thousands more in days. The mold just didn't spot the leaves. It turned the tubers into black, stinking slime underground. Farmers would go to bed with a healthy-looking field and wake up to a rotting wasteland. And the smell of decay reportedly hung over the entire countryside like a fog. Entire fields turned into rows of rotting slime. Over 1 million people died of starvation and disease, while another 1 million were forced to flee the country, changing the demographics of the world forever. All because an economic system forced an entire nation to bet their lives on one lumpy, watery, genetically vulnerable potato. Modern agriculture still struggles with this lesson. On one hand, monoculture increases efficiency and profit, and with today's family farms struggling to survive, that's a pretty hard strategy to pass up. But on the other hand, it becomes a risky gamble because it creates the perfect conditions for total collapse. The Irish potato famine is the textbook example of what happens when we forget that diversity is more than just a nice to have. It is a key to the survival of our species. While today we might obsess over dewy skin or fuller lips, the Victorians were chasing a look that was delicate, ethereal, and frankly, in today's world, pretty sickly. Pale skin and doe eyes were the ultimate standard of upper-class Victorian beauty ideals. For the light skin, women would rub creams made from arsenic, while night masks made of opium paired with a nice mercury night eye treatment, followed up with an ammonia rinse first thing in the morning, was supposed to keep them looking fresh. So that part was nailed down, I guess. But what about the doe eyes? Now, normally, your pupils dilate when you're in low light or when you're looking at someone you love. But waiting around for dusk or true romance is inefficient when you're trying to gain favor at court or secure your future with a highborn man. How can you keep that infatuated, innocent look while being bored to tears, sick, or having to sit in bright candlelight? Some women tried dropping lemon or orange juice into their eyes because the belief at the time was that the citric acid would keep their eyes youthful looking and their vision sharp. Yeah, it turns out that probably does the opposite, causing corneal abrasions and potential blindness. There was another option, Atropa belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade. Eye drops containing belladonna, beautiful woman in Italian, were known to last longer than the citric acid method thanks to their alkaloids like atropine. These work by blocking your parasympathetic nervous system, essentially preventing the pupil from constricting. Fun fact, eye doctors still use atropine to dilate your pupils for exams, but they usually advise against doing it every day to flirt. While belladonna drops may have made your pupils big and beautiful, the side effects of dropping what's essentially a nerve agent directly into your eyes, unsurprisingly, came with some pretty gnarly side effects. While you looked mysterious and alluring, you also couldn't see anything close up. Women using these drops walked around in a permanent blur, unable to read, sew, or sometimes even recognize who they were flirting with. But the blurry vision was the good side effect. With prolonged use, the poison accumulates in the system, causing sweating, rapid heartbeat, dry mouth, hallucinations, confusion, and eventually permanent blindness. The things we do for the price of beauty. While a couple of the previous entries, I guess, were about vanity or greed, this one is about good intentions that ended up paving the way to a botanical hellscape. In 1876, Japan brought a lovely ornamental vine to display at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. It had sweet-smelling flowers, large leaves that provided excellent shade for porches, and it grew fast. They called it kudzu. What they should have called it is monkey's paw. Americans loved it. and by the turn of the 20th century, they began importing its seeds into the country. It was sold as both an ornamental plant and a cheap forage option for livestock. It became one of the symbols of the American South, with kudzu clubs, festivals, and even kudzu beauty queen pageants. Fast forward to the 1930s. The U.S. is in the middle of the Dust Bowl, which many people associate with the Midwest, but the southern U.S. wasn't immune either, and the government was desperate to stop soil erosion there. The Soil Conservation Service takes one look at this fast-growing, deep-rooted vine and thinks, jackpot. But they didn't just suggest farmers planted it. Oh no, they launched a full-scale marketing campaign. They rebranded it as a miracle vine, distributing 85 million plants to farmers and promising to pay $8, about $155 today, for every acre planted with kudzu. By 1946, 3 million acres of U.S. soil were dedicated to kudzu. Sadly, the Soil Conservation Service forgot to check one minor detail. Does this plant ever stop? Spoiler, no. It does not. In Japan, kudzu had natural insect predators and cold winters that could keep it in check. In the warm, humid American South, it found its perfect habitat. Kudzu can grow a foot a day, climbing up trees until they snap under the weight or choking out native ground covers. It engulfs abandoned cars, power lines, barns, and entire houses. What's also fun is that it carries the kudzu bug and soybean rust disease, both of which can be devastating to some crops. It's now known as the vine that ate the South, covering an estimated 7 million acres in the Southeast. Eradicating it is a nightmare because its roots form massive tubers that can weigh hundreds of pounds. It's estimated that the U.S. loses up to $500 million annually on forest productivity because of kudzu, and it's not cheap to fight. Estimates range from $1,000 to $2,000 per acre per year for farmers, while power companies are estimated to spend $1.5 million a year just to keep it from damaging power lines. So, we introduced it to save the land, paid people to plant it, and now spend millions of dollars a year trying to stop it from strangling the very landscape it was supposed to protect. If you think crypto bros or NFT collectors are wild, let me introduce you to the Dutch in the 1630s. At the time, the Dutch Republic was the wealthiest trading nation on earth. They had spices, silk, and a lot of disposable income. And what they decided to spend it on? Tulips. Specifically, broken tulips, flowers with these really spectacular flame-like streaks of color. We now know that those streaks were caused by a plant virus, so they were essentially paying top dollar for sick plants. But I digress. Suddenly, these flowers became the ultimate status symbol, and a fervor erupted. You see, the Dutch had a merchant middle class, which was rare in Europe at the time, and they used tulips as a way to appear upper class. Because if you could afford tulips, you were clearly a person of status and wealth. It was one of the first keeping up with the Joneses we have such detailed records of. The price went batshit crazy. The Dutch traded in florins, and a single bulb could run anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 florins. Based on what I learned on Investopedia, translating that to today's money gets a little weird because gold florins didn't have a set standard. So estimate roughly anywhere from $50,000 to $150,000, or even up to $1 million US dollars in 2025, all for a single tulip bulb. The most I've ever paid for a plant is around $60, and that made me sweat. I can't imagine. No. But then things got weird. People stopped buying bulbs to plant in their gardens and instead flipped them for profit. It became such a profit-making machine that the Amsterdam Stock Exchange began listing tulip bulbs. The prices became disconnected from reality, like Tesla stock, and people began borrowing, betting that the bulbs they bought with the loan would both pay off the debt and set them up for life. Which reminds me, whatever happened to my Diana Beanie Baby? Anyhow, at the height of the mania in the winter of 1636, a single bulb of the Semper Augustus variety was worth about 3 times the annual salary of a Dutch merchant. It was so expensive you could either buy one bulb or a Grand Canal-side house in Amsterdam. Think about that. You could trade a flower bulb for a mansion. It was the original to the moon mentality. And then the big come down that inevitably happened. One account says that an auction going on in Haarlem on February 3rd, 1637, attracted 0 tulip buyers. I say one account because it was admittedly hearsay by the person accounting it, and auctions in another town 2 days later attracted some of the highest prices that were paid. Maybe that's when the hangover set in and people began to realize that they bet the farm, perhaps literally, unperishable. On February 7th, only 2 days after the highest prices ever seen were paid, the mass sell-off began. Prices crashed by 90% in days. The rich lost fortunes, but regular craftsmen and farmers who had leveraged everything were ruined. Tulip mania is often cited as history's first major speculative bubble. It became a centuries-long joke about greed, proof that humans can be convinced that a flower is worth more than a house, as long as everyone else agrees. Looking at some of these things people speculate on today, I'm not sure we've learned a damn thing. As I covered in my History of Orchids video, the Victorians were insane over these flowers. Not only were they exotic, but thanks to things like florography, they had specific meanings that made them all the more valuable. Red orchids meant passion and desire, yellow conveyed joy and friendship, white orchids were given to symbolize innocence and purity, pink orchids meant femininity or happiness. The rarer the orchid species, the deeper the meaning. But you couldn't just order these. You had to hire a specific type of person, the orchid hunter. They worked mostly for nurseries or extremely rich collectors because these orchid hunters brought back bulk. One famous account involves a hunter sending back 10 tons of orchids in a single shipment. 10 tons of orchids. Can you even imagine? So this one's a bit more multifaceted. First, there's the thing about the orchid hunters. These weren't botanists gently pressing flowers in a notebook. They were straight up mercenaries and risk takers who hacked their way through jungles of South America and Southeast Asia. Like, look at this guy. He is dressed like that to hunt for orchids. But there's a reason, so let's be clear. This was not a safe job. Hunters dealt with venomous snakes, jaguars, tropical diseases, hostile local tribes, and rival hunters who might just shoot them for their finds. Many of them went into the jungle and simply never came back. Orchid hunters weren't conservationists either. They were extractors. They would find a pristine valley filled with a rare species, harvest every single plant they could, and then burn the rest of the forest down to ensure that no rival hunter could find the same species, keeping the price high. Also, going back to the dude who brought back 10 tons of orchids, the problem with 10 tons of anything is the math. For every orchid that bloomed in a London conservatory, hundreds died in the cargo hold of a ship. Speaking of, one irony of all of this is that so much of the orchid hunting was done in vain because these rich collectors had no idea how to care for these plants. Orchids would bloom once, then die. So collectors went back for more, stripping jungles bare. Some orchid species went extinct, while others never recovered their wild populations. The craze eventually died down as cultivation methods improved and, presumably, as they ran out of things to kill. But the legacy of orchid delirium is a stark reminder that when humans fetishize rarity, we tend to love nature to death. Before 1900, the American chestnut was one of the most important trees in eastern North America. Called the redwood of the East, these trees would grow up to 100 feet tall and were remarkably rot-resistant, making them clutch for timber production. It was also an abundant nut producer, feeding everything from bears and turkeys to rural Appalachian families who relied on it for income. It was a cornerstone species, meaning it was considered ecologically, economically, and culturally vital. Then, in 1904, someone, likely a nurseryman in the Bronx, imported some Japanese chestnut trees. They were smaller than the American varieties and cute, so they might have been brought to the U.S. as an ornamental curiosity. Regardless, they didn't travel alone. They brought a fungal pathogen, Cryphonectria parasitica, probably better known as chestnut blight. But it was cool. Japanese chestnut trees evolved with this fungus over thousands of years, then they developed a resistance to it. American chestnuts, however, were not resistant. The fungus was airborne, spreading up to 50 miles every year. It entered through cracks in the bark and strangled the tree from the inside out. In just a few decades, it killed nearly 4 billion chestnut trees. And when the trees died, the economy of Appalachia crashed with them. It's considered the greatest forest disaster in human history. Today, the species is functionally extinct. You can still find sprouts growing from old root systems, but the blight always finds them and kills them before they can mature. For our final disaster, we're going to Lyon, France in the 19th century. Lyon was the silk capital of the world, and the government had big plans. They wanted to expand the industry into a massive empire. Very quick run over if you're unaware. Silk comes from silkworm cocoons via a process called sericulture. The eggs hatch, then the larvae feed on a strict diet of mulberry leaves, then grow and spin their cocoons. Once the cocoons are made, and this is the grim part, you boil the cocoons to kill the pupa and loosen the threads, which are then unspooled and woven into fabric. And then you have silk. So, for sericulture to happen, you need three things: silkworms, mulberry trees, and cheap labor. At the top of this silk pyramid, you have about 1,400 bankers, merchants, and silk workers. They work together to make sure the machine ran smoothly. Under them are 8,000 skilled silk craftsmen called kenus, who in turn had over 30,000 journeymen and apprentices who were essentially day laborers. Then, at the bottom, at least in terms of pay, were women and errand boys. Okay, so just like the tulips, the speculators, wealthy merchants, government officials, and investors hoped to get rich quickly and were convinced the demand for silk would never end. So they poured money into planting millions of mulberry trees. The market was soon flooded with silk, but the merchants in Lyon were determined to keep their profit margins fat. So, to offset the cost of their risky investments, they set the canus price rates as low as possible. Basically, they bet the entire economy on a single luxury fabric and a single type of tree, while treating the people who actually made the stuff like disposable parts. It started with economics and ended with biology. First, the labor crisis. When merchants cut wages in 1831, the canoe revolted under the banner "Live Working or Die Fighting." They seized Lyon, forcing the army to invade their own city. Thousands died in uprisings over the next 15 years. But then nature decided to kick them while they were down. By the 1850s, a mysterious plague called pebrine began wiping out silkworms. It was called pepper disease because the worms were covered in tiny black spots and couldn't spin cocoons. The industry was on the verge of total collapse until they called in a heavy hitter, Louis Pasteur. Yes, that Louis Pasteur. He spent 5 years studying the disease, realized it was hereditary, and developed a method to screen the eggs under a microscope, saving the European silk trade from extinction. But by then the damage was done. Between class warfare, economic bubble burst, and biological plagues, the French silk empire was never the same. It's a reminder that you can have all the trees and money in the world, but if you ignore the workers or the microbes, it all falls apart. But wait, there's more. Because why should France have all the disastrous fun? While Lyon was burning, the United States decided, hey, we should get in on that. In the 1830s, the U.S. government and private speculators decided America should produce its own silk. They imported the same miracle tree the French used, Morus multicaulis. Americans inflated their own silk bubble like crazy. It wasn't just farmers, doctors, lawyers, and even Daniel Webster got caught up in the frenzy. People weren't even bothering to make silk anymore. They were just day trading the trees. A sapling that cost 30 cents one year could sell for $5 the next. And of course, where there's mania, there's fraud. Hucksters sold premium silkworm eggs that turned out to be fish eggs or just balls of beeswax. And then came the crash. Through 1839, prices free fell. Trees started the year at $1.25, about $44 today. We're selling for 2 cents by December, equivalent to around 70 cents now. One nursery loaded their worthless trees onto a leaky ship, insured the cargo, and sent it to New Orleans, praying it would sink so they could collect the insurance money. The ship didn't sink. They were stuck with the trees. Then, nature finished the job. A harsh winter in 1840 killed millions of the trees, and a blight wiped out the rest in 1844. Plus, that pebrine disease I mentioned earlier, it showed up too, devastating the worms. The mulberry mania crash left abandoned plantations across the Northeast. Some silk manufacturing survived. Companies like the Cheney brothers pivoted to importing raw silk instead, but the dream of a domestic silk empire died with the trees. Investors were ruined, nurseries burned their inventory for firewood, and as one veteran of the craze later admitted, the problem was simple. Quote, "We made haste to be rich."
America wins again.
Before you head out full of doom and gloom, there is some good news on the horizon because it seems we're getting better at learning from these mistakes. Conservation efforts are underway for endangered orchids and American chestnuts. Invasive species management is a real field now, and modern agriculture is embracing crop diversity as a hedge against catastrophe. But let's be honest, we'll probably make new mistakes. That's what humans do. The trick is making sure the next plant disaster is at least a little less catastrophic than the last one. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this, dive into the story of Silphium, a plant that might have been loved to extinction. Till next time, greenies, stay curious and maybe think twice before planting that pretty shrub in your backyard.